Hey everybody, it's Mrs. Clemens, and here's another episode where we're going to be talking about the Cold War. We're going to talk about some of the origins of the Cold War, which was a period of tensions between the United States of America and the Soviet Union, and it started right at the end of World War II in 1945 and went till about 1991. And in the picture you have up here, I don't know if you guys can recognize who these people are. This is John F. Kennedy, and this is Nikita Khrushchev. We're going to be talking about them in a later presentation. All right, so World War II happens, and even during the war, they were the major powers, the big four, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States, were talking about how things were going to be organized after the war. And one of the things that they decided was they need to divide up Germany because at this point, they were a major player in two world wars. And the thought was if they could divide up Germany, that would prevent them from launching another attack in Europe. And so you can see from this map down here how they divided up Germany, that you have a Soviet sector in East Germany, you have a British sector, you have a French sector, and you have an American sector. And so what this ended up being known as was West Germany. Collectively, they all became one nation, and then East Germany. And then on top of dividing the country into basically two parts, they also divided up the capital, Berlin. And Berlin was found in East Germany, you can see it there. And they also divided that up as well initially into four parts, and then it became just East Berlin, which was run by the Soviets, and West Berlin, which was run by the Allies. So West Germany and West Berlin were democratic and capitalistic. East Germany and East Berlin used communism. So here we go. The war is over. Truman is president. Stalin is the head of the Soviet Union. And so Stalin is not a big fan of Western influence in Eastern Germany. And so he decides he needs to get those guys out. And so the way that we had been running things is we would drive. we would take roads. We would deliver goods and materials because this is right after the war and you're trying to rebuild everything. So you would go by surface roads. And so what the Soviets did, what Stalin did, was he cut off our access by land. So thinking that there's no way that Truman's going to be able to deal with that. What Truman ends up doing is saying, all right, fine, you know what? You won't let us go in by land, then we will go in by air. And so you end up having the Berlin airlift that lasts about a year. And this is a major, major, major undertaking where thousands and thousands of flights are taking place and where, our planes are dropping all kinds of different supplies. I definitely recommend you look up the video about the candy bomber. It's something I usually show in class. It's pretty neat. So they're getting all kinds of supplies. And so this is doing a couple of things. I always tell kids that the Cold War is sort of like a giant chess match. There's not really direct fighting between the US and the Soviets, but there's one-upmanship. And so this, we definitely got, we did well in our chess match for this. So part of it is to show the Soviets, hey, we won't be intimidated. But the other part of it was to get goodwill with the Germans. And it actually works extremely well. When you look at who our allies are today, one of our closest allies is Germany. So this was extremely successful. And as you all know from knowing me, I love propaganda. This was actually on an AP exam, I think last year. People had a good time with memes. But yeah, we get a lot of propaganda from this, like milk, the new weapon of democracy. And so obviously they weren't dropping glasses of milk, it was dried milk. But the people really need that. And you could see the kids are super excited. Here's the lineup of all the planes. We just saw this picture of all the kids getting candy. And so it got a lot of really goodwill towards the United States. All right, so multiple choice. What was the main purpose of the Truman Doctrine that we talked about last time, the Marshall Plan that we talked about last time, and the Berlin Airlift? All right, so was it to control Nazism in Europe, establishing friendly relations between the US and the Soviet Union, spreading democracy to developing nations, or limiting Soviet expansion? All right, so remember, guys, we're talking about the foreign policy that we have right now is containment during the Cold War. So think about what they were trying to contain. So we said it was after World War II, so it's not going to be one. No, this is the Cold War, so we're probably not going to have friendly relations between us and the Soviet Unions. So now we're down to 3 and 4. And if you think about what the definition of containment is, it's exactly this, that we're trying to limit Soviet expansion. All right, so if you're going to have a war, you need to have alliances. And so even though this was a Cold War with not a lot of active fighting between the major players of the US and the Soviet Union, you still need to have alliances. So there are 2 major alliances. The first one is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And so if you look at this map, you can see North Atlantic. So not, Latin America is not in there. So US and Canada, and then European nations. And so again, this is the idea is containment, trying to stop the spread of communism. This is a later image of who was in or who is in NATO, and it goes up to 2009. New countries come into NATO all the time, which is actually really interesting and causes a lot of controversy. That's more for global, but their nemesis was the Warsaw Pact. And that was basically you had to join if you were a satellite nation of the Soviets. And so you can see here where the Warsaw Pact was, the Soviet Union and some of their satellite nations. The Warsaw Pact does not exist anymore. And some of these nations that were part of the Warsaw Pact, and you can see that here, are now part of NATO. Like I said, controversy. All right, multiple choice break. In the period after World War II, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was formed to supervise the government of West Germany, establish common trade market for Western European nations, provide collective security against communist aggression, or create a new world court. Well, hopefully, since we just talked about it, you know that the answer is 3. All right, so like I've been saying, Cold War means, like I like to think of it as like this chess match sort of thing, where there wasn't direct fighting between the US and the Soviets. However, there were other actual hot wars or conflicts, and one of them was in Korea. And so this is where, and we'll talk about this more in our next presentation, this idea of the domino theory comes in. And so again, Truman is president. And while he's president, China becomes communist. You might remember some of those discussions in Global II with the whole movement with Mao Zedong versus Deng Jieshi, or Deng Xiaoping. And so China becomes communist. So now, after World War II, communism starts moving into Korea, the Korean Peninsula. And so North Korea becomes communist, and they're moving their way down the peninsula. Well, so Truman looks at this as a challenge that we cannot allow communism to spread because, again, our foreign policy is containment. So this is the first time that the United Nations springs into action in a military conflict. We were talking about that in the last presentation about how they were supposed to be a peacekeeping organization. And so this was a bit controversial. So yeah, this was a united action. This was not just the United States in there. There were nations around the world that were working to push communism back out of Korea. This is often called the Forgotten War because it happens just a bit after World War II. And it doesn't get the same attention that World War II gets prior to it and Vietnam gets after it. But what ends up happening is at the end, Korea is divided at the 38th parallel. I'm going to show you a nifty animation in a second. And so today, this is the demilitarized zone. You have North Korea that's communist and South Korea that's democratic. So yeah, this is kind of a mess. So when you look at the red is representing the communists, and the green is representing the United Nations. You can see that it's a struggle, that throughout the war they're just kind of going back and forth. And what ultimately happens is we call an armistice to the war. Technically, the war has not ended. There's not an actual official treaty to the Korean War. And also the Korean War is not actually a declared war being declared by Congress either. In case you get on Jeopardy sometime, you need to do that. All right, and I have a couple of photographs and political cartoons. So this cartoon illustrates what I was just talking about, because remember we talked about how the United Nations was basically an updated version of the League of Nations, and here you have the United Nations, and this is Truman running over the grave of the League of Nations. So if we were looking at the point of view of this cartoon, you could tell that it's critical of this action. We have a couple of photos of the Korean War, and I assigned you guys some videos to watch about the Korean War. And then if you ever get the chance to go to Washington, D.C., there's a Korean War Memorial, and it's really, really neat. You can see here's sort of a more aerial kind of view. You see all these soldiers that are out on patrol. And so when you walk around there, you can actually kind of see these life-size soldiers out walking on patrol. It's very beautiful and very eerie. I hope you guys get the chance to go there at some point. And I always like showing this picture because it illustrates the differences between North and South Korea. So South Korea is one of our biggest trading partners. It's certainly an ally of ours. And you can see this is a satellite image of Korea, the Korean Peninsula at night. And you can see, here's Seoul, that they're an industrial nation. When you look at North Korea, you don't see the same thing. And basically, the reason for this is a lot of the policies of the government of this country, which makes it so that they don't have the resources that the South has. All right, multiple choice break. What is a valid conclusion based on the United States' involvement in the Korean War? The policy of containment was applied in Asia as well as Europe. United Nations economic sanctions were more effective than military action. Sanctions is something where you use basically restrictions on a country's economy or ability to trade to try to force them to change their actions. The American people will support the United States' participation in any war, whether declared or undeclared. And we talked about how there was definitely a lot of people who did not support the war. And for United States, oops, typo, the United States cooperation with a wartime ally ends when the war ends. And so now when we look at this, the answer is one, that definitely containment was applied all over the world, and we're going to be talking more about that as we go. All right, guys, tune in next time when we're going to talk about the Cold War at home.